Welcome everybody to this plenary session. Dr. Daniel Araya is a good friend, but he's also somebody who I thought of immediately when we wrote this theme, and we're trying to understand digital technologies, the fourth industrial revolution, what is the future of organizations, big and small. Dan has a PhD in education. He's worked in policy circles. He has been a public intellectual. He writes for Forbes, Brookings Institute, among other prominent and public platforms. He's also worked in governments and across the board. He's found the kind of empirical evidence and theoretical frameworks to understand and interpret the world that we have today. And he's got a great skill at synthesizing complex phenomena and touching on important theoretical paradigms while still keeping in touch with the everyday. So it's my honor to hand over the microphone. I am jealous. He did tell me he's in Mexico right now, which I'm not happy about. But I am looking forward to his talk.
Well, let's assume that the good weather will make the talk that much better. Thanks, Phil, very much. Good to be here with you all today. This is a broad talk. I mean, it's as macro, I think, as you can get. My work largely focuses on the convergence of geopolitics and what people call disruptive technologies. So I look at you might say the longue durée of how technologies transform systems, social, political, economic systems. So let me share my screen here. Okay, good. So, this is a big topic, so it's going to be a broad discussion, but the anchor of the topic is technological change. And within that smaller box is going to be a discussion on AI and specifically what people call augmented intelligence, which is a variation of the discussion, looking more at how we deploy it as human beings, how we leverage it to transform our surroundings and our environment, and how this whole transformation is converging with geopolitical system shift that we're undergoing that many people are talking about in various circles. So I'll introduce myself, I guess, briefly. I'm a senior fellow with a think tank called CG, which is it's a Center for National Governance Innovation. And it's technology biased in its assessments, but it helps governments around the world look at social and political changes and how to make policy in order to adapt to these changes. And it's a wide breadth of subject matter that they cover. So I don't think it'll be a surprise to anyone watching this that we're in what looks like a massive technological revolution. The only question is what's the scale? I'm speculating the scale is much, much larger than what we had called the Industrial Revolution. In many ways, this is an extension of that revolution. The shift, though, is around software. So to look at it, it's some kind of broad frame of reference. You can see going back to the rise of Europe and the rise of the West around the 18th and 19th centuries, around the steam engine. The 19th century was railways, the telephone, the automobile, obviously electricity. And more recently in the 20th century, which many call the US century, was computers, beginning in the 50s and 60s and then maturing with the internet. What's going on now is something a lot more comprehensive that builds on those technologies. We're exiting the era of fossil fuels. So those are largely stranded assets. What we're entering into is an era of innovation that leverages AI to build on a computing platform. Now, these are some of the areas. There are a lot of different ways to slice this up, but these are considered 5 platforms for the technologies that are now impacting us, and some of which are a little ways down the road. So autonomous vehicles obviously is getting a lot of press, 3D printing, robotics, battery storage, space exploration, particularly the commercial sector, is now beginning to take off. Lots and lots of money invested in that space. New synthetic materials, mobility as a service, meaning that the future forecast is that fewer people will buy cars, essentially, and that they'll leverage social platforms in order to access transportation. That's just automation as one category. Then obviously genetics, genomics, DNA sequencing, gene therapy, cancer treatments, diagnostics, bioinformatics. All of this is about a better understanding DNA and making changes ahead of the curve before those diseases manifest. That's a long pipeline that's really just starting to mature now. And then the more concrete examples of change that we've already seen: cloud computing, big data, AI, mobility, Internet of Things, which is something like a self-aware infrastructure that bridges automation and digital communication between systems. There's a lot of design around infrastructure for digital twins, if you're familiar with that term, this idea that software facilitates both the management of systems and the systems managing themselves over time. So the more interesting area, I think, around digital technology is the financial sector and banking. So what we're seeing is a fairly radical disruption of finance and banking, not just around Bitcoin and blockchain and cryptocurrencies, but around transformation of infrastructure, particularly legacy infrastructure that has been pretty resistant to change for a long time, for some good reasons and for some bad reasons. But the sort of thing you saw happen in music and communications is now happening to banking. So you can assume that there are many banks around the world that are going to go out of business, and new retail banks that will emerge, even around software companies like Facebook and Apple. All right. So at the heart of all this is software, as I said. At the peak, or the sort of the tip of the spear of software is AI and machine learning. These technologies have been in the pipeline and maturing for some time, some decades, at least since the 60s, but it's only very recent, in the last decade, that new forms of artificial intelligence around deep learning and machine learning have really reached maturity and are now beginning to eat into a lot of different industries, including, as I say, below retail, insurance, healthcare, medical diagnosis, military defense, banking, finance, factory automation, and transportation. There's a fairly famous venture capitalist named Mark Andreessen, who's an alumni of University of Illinois. He explains that software is eating the world. And that's not a hyperbole, right? That is happening. So underlying, or I guess on top of this transformative period, is geopolitical shift. And this geopolitical shift is rooted in, partly at least, in a technological transformation. At the apex of this battle of the titans is the United States and China. The US has been kind of the major lever of innovation for the past century or two, at least the 20th century. And now there's good reason to believe that China is accelerating beyond the United States. The takeoff is something like an exponential curve. China's development, its evolution looks linear at first and then becomes quite exponential. Part of the reason for that is just scale. It's a giant country. Another part of the reason for that is long-term planning. They plan well, and that's something we can discuss later. So technology is a partial driver of this global transformation. And it's not just technology, it's also policy and decision-making. The US has made a lot of bad decisions over the last 40 or 50 years. And we're seeing that shake out now. And it's going to be very difficult for the United States to restructure itself in order to both mediate the shift and just manage what could be a massive economic unraveling. It's a strong possibility. So if we just look at hard data, going back to 2000, the United States was clearly the largest supplier of goods and services around the world. It dominated most of the planet. Going back to the Second World War, the United States was the only country standing in the Western world after World War II. And as a consequence, it was able to build essentially a kind of empire on top of that. This economic empire, you could debate whether it was benevolent or whether it was tyrannical. There's a lot of, I think, evidence on both sides. But nonetheless, that era is coming to an end. And the question is whether it's a hard ending or a soft ending. That's still hard to say. But China is dominating everywhere economically across almost every vertical. And the most important area is AI. And that's where the US still leads, particularly in terms of research, but China is making significant strides. particularly in deployment. China applies AI better because it deploys it from the top down, whereas the United States and the Western world is focused on markets, market-led innovation, and the consequences that it's quite fragmented in its deployment of things like AI. Okay, so this is the summary overview of the sections I'm going to go through. The first is looking at how computing has transformed the nature of work. This is followed by Asia becoming the center of world trade, then the end of the American era, and finally how augmented intelligence or the application of AI to innovation will reshape the post-pandemic world. Now, the last section maybe is the most pertinent to this discussion. This would have happened anyway, probably over the next decade, but because of COVID, it's accelerating much, much faster now. Okay, so let's look at how computing has transformed the nature of work. I mean, it's probably obvious to most people that automation is, anchors all this. The discourse on this sort of frames it as, for the Germans, it's Industry 4.0. For the World Economic Forum, it's the fourth industrial revolution. The discussions vary, but the argument is that we are seeing a new stage of modernity, you might say, in which the Internet of Things, digital infrastructure, and smart systems begin to evolve semi-independently from human agency. So there's no doubt that it's rooted in smart engineering, but because of machine learning, these systems will begin to learn independently of human action or agency. And just to, in 1784, you go back to the initial steam engine, sort of the anchor of modernity, and then the assembly line, and then automation and computing, electronics. I think there's Jeremy Rifkin, for example, makes an argument that this is not the fourth industrial revolution. It's an acceleration of the third industrial revolution, that you can't separate computing and electronics and automation from smart systems and AI and Internet of Things. I think there's a lot of legitimacy to that as well. Nonetheless, so let's look at the impact of automation. There's a debate about how far it will go, how deep it will eat into industry. I think you can safely assume it's going to eat very deep into some industries and much less so in others. The one area people underappreciate is white collar work. That's where software is going to have the most substantial impact. People like to think about automation in terms of factory robotics. That happened in the 70s and 80s. This is the next stage of that. It's going to scale up across offices and business infrastructure. AI and big data, when deployed at scale, because you have to remember there's software. It's software, so it's quite cheap to reproduce. When it is deployed at scale, it begins to make it possible for entrepreneurs to get into different domains of various industries in ways that maybe the big players didn't want to do or weren't interested because there wasn't enough return on capital. But as this occurs, you're going to see the impact. This is not to say there'll be no other jobs, but the kind of jobs, particularly in legal profession, medicine, certainly retail, transportation, I think a lot of those are going to be gone. So anyway, AI and big data will augment learning and decision-making. This is sort of critical to understanding where we're going, the human species, in terms of evolution. And it'll be, in terms of education policy, for those of you in that area, I'll just state openly that I think the education system is in crisis. And I think that the problem is deploying skills is irrelevant, right? It's not going to be about skills. It's going to be about creativity and ingenuity. Skills are built into the systems themselves, right? That's what the software does. So what you want to be able to do is leverage the software through ingenuity and innovative ways. So what I would frame this as, for those of you that are in the social sciences and trying to understand, what is the role of human beings in a highly automated system, or highly automated economy, you have to think in terms of creativity and problem solving, right? This is kind of routine discussion now, but it's going to have to be a fundamental reorientation in terms of how human resources, training, and education are delivered. Or constructed, I guess I should say. So, and this is where augmented intelligence becomes kind of a critical discussion or a critical discourse. AI, built AI as software, is the goal and aspiration for automation. That is, base case for what AI does. But it also augments human abilities to do things that we couldn't do before, right? We can process humongous amounts of data in order to draw conclusions we just couldn't do before, right? Using more simplistic research methods. And on top of that, we're able to do more complex design. So as an example, the space industry is something that most people think about as way off in the future, that it's, 22nd century, 23rd century, if at all, that it's science fiction. But in fact, because of software and machine systems, you can already see that SpaceX is evolving the process of space exploration in nonlinear ways. And that is becoming much more readily available to countries outside the West. So for example, India, China, also Japan, the European Union, but Dubai, new emerging economies are going to be able to leverage these tools to make a much more complex environment for something like space exploration. And what I mean by that is, beyond satellites, we're going to probably have solar-based stations. We're going to have infrastructure in space that will make it possible to go after resources in space that just might have been impossible last century, just didn't have the computing power. But at any rate, the big shift is a shift away from extrinsic reward. So in other words, remuneration for work to indigenous or intrinsic passion. So what you do has to be what you really want to do. If what you're doing is not what you really want to do, then you can be sure that whatever routine work you do will be displaced. And so there's a lot of soul searching, I think, that has to occur in particularly advanced economies, but across the world, and understanding what the nature of work is about. Okay, so let's look at Asia as a center of world trade. And this may seem to depart slightly, but it's to give a larger frame of reference for what's going on, because it's not just about technology, but there's no doubt that technology is a fundamental part of it. So this is The Economist. It's from 2018. The Economist did a fairly large study trying to look at where the center of world trade is. And over the last 2 centuries, you can see that the center of world trade has drifted, right, from the Middle East across to Europe. While Europe, in the rise of the colonization, exploration, and settlement of the Americas, that bolstered Europe's position. I mean, but prior to that, it would have been China and India. But at any rate, now the center is returning, first with the rise of Japan in the mid-20th century, and then with the rise of the Tigers, and finally China. By 2025 or perhaps 2030, I would say 2025 to 2030, we're going to see China and that region, particularly Southeast Asia and India, as the center of world trade, which will have massive effects on the global economy. So COVID-19 is accelerating all this reset of the global order. And part of the reason why that's happening is that Western economies are just not disciplined. And so the cost of the lack of social discipline has been a breakdown in managing healthcare. And the consequence of that is the economies are in advanced countries are going to be stuck for some time, not just until we get immunization, but beyond that. The economic crisis is substantial. It's going to affect small and medium-sized enterprises. That will be, as the basis of consumption-driven economies, will be the foundation of what could be a massive market collapse. Now, I know that sounds bad, and that's worst-case scenario, but it's a legitimate problem. So broadly speaking, the world is bifurcating between a US-led global north and a China-led global south. Rich countries are graying. This is another problem. Demographics, emerging markets in India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa are the future of global growth. Most investors are looking outside Western economies now because that's where the consumption patterns are going. The US turning inward, partly because I think it's scared, to be frank, and partly because it's struggling with a kind of social crisis that's been building for some time around inequality. So as the US turns inward, China's expanding outward dramatically at a scale that even Europe, I'm not sure, accelerated this quickly. But China's Belt and Road Initiative is laying down the infrastructure, you might say the pipes, for a new Chinese empire of sorts that involves trade of all kinds of goods and services. And this is just the basic platform of a global spanning order. You might compare it to the ghost cities that were commented on over the last 5 years. China's model is not market driven, it's state driven. And so what China does is it lays down infrastructure first, and then over time it moves people into cities, and then eventually it begins to use policy to incubate the economy. So it's a different sort of economic model. Now, there's also been a lot of debate about anti-globalization or the end of globalization. That's not the case at all. What's happening is regionalization. The West is getting smaller. It's a smaller relative portion of the world economy. Asia is getting much larger, and China is a big portion of that. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is the largest trade deal in the world now, recently signed, took some time to produce. It's not as substantial as it could be, but it'll mature into something much, I think, much deeper and more significant. It's 1/3 of the world's population, would have been more, but India decided not to take part. 2.2 billion people, 1/3 of global GDP, or 26 trillion. And of course, China is at the center of that. So the Chinese economy, as it continues to grow, will be, I think, the anchor point for all trade deals across the Asian region, reaching from Europe to Australia. Okay, so this is a really important map, I think, because it gives you a sense of what's gone wrong, okay? If you look at the developed world, you see a lot of petroleum as the largest exports. If you look at Asia, you see computing as the largest exports. Now, this tells you everything you need to know about what's coming, right? We are exiting petroleum, whether people want to believe it or not. And we are entering a high-tech digital world. So what you want to do is get out of petroleum and into digital technologies, right? This is not what's happening in the West, right? The West has been biding its time, wasting its time, in my opinion, and now is falling behind. This is a global reset in which China will be the largest economy in the world. It already is the largest by PPP. But because of COVID, it could be the largest as soon as 3 or 4 years from now in GDP terms. But there's another question of how large will it become? I suspect within 20 years, it'll be at least twice the size of the United States. And it could eventually become 3 or 4 times the size. There's no reason why it couldn't continue to scale, because the population is highly productive. The government, you can criticize its top-down management. It runs like a corporation, and that's very efficient, even if it's not equitable entirely, or what's the right word, liberal, right? So this is the infrastructure China's laying down, the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the beginning. It's the largest infrastructure build out in history. It's many times the size of the Marshall Plan. What it is empire building, and what it's going to become is a trade infrastructure that will leverage China's expansion across many sectors, including gas and oil, which has to stop, but eventually across more advanced technologies like solar, wind, data, software, and AI. So this is debatable, but here's where China's strong. Renewables, infrastructure, manufacturing, steel production, 5G, AI and robotics, quantum communications, which they're pioneering. Virtual reality, fintech, blockchain, and cryptocurrency. China is leveraging a digital renminbi, which is the first fiat cryptocurrency. That has a lot of implications, because what it means is that as the Belt and Road Initiative becomes globally dominant across our emerging economies, it can use its own currency to do trade deals, and that currency can trade across platforms. So it doesn't have to be, fiat currency, physical currency, but it's software. So billionaire investor Ray Dalio predicts that China will eclipse and replace the United States over the course of this century. And what he means by that is not just that it'll be the largest economy in the world, or that it'll have the most influence, but that it'll be a hegemonic power on the scale of what the US was. So in other words, it'll replace it militarily, politically, et cetera. China is moving to become the world's dominant economy. That's obvious. Renminbi, Dalio thinks the renminbi will be eventually the world's reserve currency. I think all that part's debatable. We have no idea how this is going to shake out, but there's no doubt that China is going to become the largest economy in the world by many standards. Okay, so this is a quick map that Dalio's team put together to map out the rise and fall of empires going back to 1500. You can see the United States is the blue line, China is the red line. China has had a substantial influence on the global economy for most of the past 2 centuries. The United States obviously is a very new country. It's an extension of European empires to a large degree, but is unique unto itself as well. And what we're seeing now potentially is a radical decline of the United States, or maybe not, right? That's also part of the debate. This is just looking at reserve currency empires. In other words, every dominant economy will have its own reserve currency. That is the global reserve currency. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but just to give you a sense of China's rise here in 2000 is now just taking off, whereas the United States looks to be in decline across a lot of different categories. And then this final one, comparing the US and China with some level of detail. So trade, output, competitiveness, military, innovation and technology, financial center reserve status. So if you look at, for example, competitiveness, China's doing very well. If you look at the military, China's accelerating. The US is still much further ahead. And reserve status, China's nowhere to be seen. No one's using the renminbi. Okay, so the post-American world. Let's look at what that means, because when I make the argument against the American era being sustainable, I'm not saying the United States disappears as a global power. I'm just saying that it's no longer a hegemonic power. So for almost 5 decades, the United States has guided the growth of an innovation-driven order. That order is coming to an end. Accelerated by the current health crisis, the world economy is now regionalizing, with China leading emerging economies. Beyond the era of US hegemony, what we're increasingly seeing is a rising techno-nationalism that strategically leverages the network effects of technology to reshape a post-Bretton Woods order. Now, China didn't destroy the Bretton Woods order, but China's taking advantage of the vacuum that's emerged as a consequence of what looks like a very unstable US financial system. The United States left the gold standard in '71, and since then, the dollar has been its own standard. And so that means that the world economy trusts the US dollar without any backing of any kind, without the backing of a scarce resource like gold or something else. And so the global economy hinges on the confidence that investors put in America as an institution. Now, this may last for some period of time, but it may not, right? It's something to take seriously. Outside the West, emerging markets are where the growth is going, where the growth will occur. This is partly demographics. So as an example, by 2015, nearly a quarter or more of the population will be 60 or older across everywhere outside of Africa. So it's in fact not just the West, but most of the world. But in Europe and in advanced economies, people are aging faster. So about 1/4 of Europeans today are 60 or older. It will be more than a third by 2050, right? So the problem with that is that if you don't have a productive human resource base, you can't necessarily pay taxes, build infrastructure. There is an argument to be made that with automation, workers will matter less. So that's a good debate to be had. But you still need consumption if you're building in a capitalist economy. And so the fact is that young people consume more than older people. And so the older your population gets, the less the population consumes. And it does look like that with developed countries, as countries urbanize, they have fewer children, to the point that they don't reproduce themselves. And as that occurs, the population shrinks. So in the most obvious example here, Bosnia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Hungary, Japan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Romania, Serbia, Ukraine, these populations will shrink by 15% within the next 30 years. Japan will shrink almost by half by the end of the century, to give you some sense. So anyway, demography is destiny. These are the countries which are 45 and older, the developed world. Africa in particular is very young. And then if you look across Asia, Southeast Asia, very young as well. And young people consume, right? That's the point of the economics of it. So if we look at what we mean by the United States in decline, we have to understand what it means, I guess. And so as China ascends the technology value chain, it will almost certainly dominate global markets across almost every category. And what I mean by that is it won't, even the markets it doesn't dominate through its own production, it will dominate through value change. And that's exactly what the Belt and Road is all about, building value chains across Asia. So its businesses, its companies, its organizations, and its government will use technology to leverage those value chains to produce and consume and distribute goods at a scale that only it can do, because it's 1/5 of the world's population, right? And highly, highly productive and efficient. So in the United States, this has become very obvious to many. The Trump administration, you could argue, has been anchored in this worry. So Trump weaponized trade to slow China's rise, but mushrooming debt levels in the United States, both public and private, alongside excessive military spending, crumbling infrastructure, are destabilizing the United States. And this is obvious not just in the recent, incident on Capitol Hill, but in the polarization of politics, in the inequality economically. And another area which people don't often look at is intergenerational wealth. So I'll get to that in a second, but let's suffice to say that the millennials and Gen Z are very poor, and their chance of developing or growing wealth is quite difficult, given the levels of debt the United States is carrying, some $27 trillion of debt that they'll have to figure out how to manage. So what we're seeing essentially is something like the 1930s, which is financial speculation, growing inequality, stoking populism and rage, right? Now that led to Nazism and it led to fascism, and it's percolating again across the advanced world because people don't know how to solve this problem. And so it's easier to scapegoat, obviously, than it is to break down something as simple as paying debt, right? Because that's essentially what underlies it, is massive debt accumulation. So together, debt, economic stagnation, the threat of ecological collapse are features of what amounts to essentially a dying order. This system's dying. If you want to look in more detail at the debt levels, this is a chart of debt. So what's interesting about the United States is that it's had 3 substantial climatic events that have transformed its identity and its relationship to the world, right? Beginning first with the War of Independence, followed by the Civil War, and then a climax of events converging around World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, which you could say are in a sense one period. And then now with COVID, starting with the 2008 crisis, COVID, and what looks like probably a coming market collapse. So all of this is rooted in debt, and this chart is by the Congressional Budget Office. It's forecasting or predicting debt from 2020 on, and this is before COVID, right? So this gives you a sense of the levels of debt the United States is facing, right? The only reason, or the only way the United States has been able to manage debt so far is having foreign countries buy up treasuries and in a sense, pay that debt. But that's probably going to change. And if it does, then the US will have to shoulder the burden by itself. Okay, so let's look at US household wealth, because it's critical to understanding some of the miscalculation in policymaking in the United States. So taken together, the boomers, say 65 and older, something like that. The silent generation is a generation above them. They control some 2/3 of wealth. That's not good if you're trying to build a productive economy, right? The cost is that each new generation has less wealth. And the reason for that is the tax policies that Reagan introduced in the 80s. And so what it's done is it's created a bubble of wealth at one level and a deficit at another. And the cost of that is that the US looks more and more like a kind of hereditary feudal society in which wealth is accumulated by having it handed down, right? So in other words, people make less, relatively speaking, you accumulate more and you hand it back. And then if the tax structure benefits you, then your offspring will be well off, but it doesn't lead to much consumption, right? So feudalism's never been good at building wealthy economies. So these are just a list of strategic policy challenges. This departs, I realize, a little bit from talking about augmented intelligence, but it'll circle back and I think it'll make sense. So this is all the problems, or some subset of the problems that the Biden administration is facing, right? So the decline of the Bretton Woods multilateral order, declining confidence in the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, climate change, job automation, regulating the data economy, desperate needs for investments in infrastructure, and not just the established infrastructure of the 20th century, but the next generation infrastructure, renewables, for example, immigration reform, intergenerational wealth transfer or wealth crisis, tax reform, structural reform of government, debt management. The US now owes 27 trillion and growing. So these kinds of problems are not solved easily. And I think that it's fair to say that it'll take a generation or two to resolve them. So let's look at, going back to technology, what does this mean ultimately for the global order? Where are we going, right? I think it's good to start with smart people. And Douglas Englebart was an engineer in the 20th century. He, I think, understood better than anyone the power of digital technologies to augment human capabilities. He coined the term augmented intelligence. His quote, "The digital revolution is far more significant than the invention of writing or even the printing press." I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but I like that. I like the idea of it. So if we had to define our terms, augmented intelligence refers to the ongoing impact of AI and amplifying tool-mediated innovation. And that's the key, right? It's the tools that are leverageable for transformation. So augmented intelligence is an alternative conceptualization of artificial intelligence that focuses on AI's assistive role in advancing human capabilities, especially human cognitive capabilities. So this is my own, I guess, contribution to what I think is what's going on. This is a computational revolution, much larger than the Industrial Revolution, but comparable to the Industrial Revolution. So where the Agricultural Revolution harnessed domesticated animals for pastoral farming, in the Industrial Revolution designed machines for factory production, so today the computational revolution is leveraging AI to augment human innovation, right? And the key is innovation. That's where we're going. And the speed of innovation is accelerating. And as it accelerates, everything else becomes irrelevant. So in other words, labor that's routine, companies that are trying to hold position by just building moats to defend themselves, none of that will work in this period. So this is I probably should put this in earlier order, but this is Englebart's definition. Augmenting human intellect, we mean increasing the capability of man to approach a complex problem situation, to gain comprehension to suit a particular needs and to derive solutions to problems, better solutions, and the possibility of finding solutions to problems that before seemed insoluble. And this is the key. It's solving problems that we weren't able to solve before. So what we're seeing essentially is a convergence of technologies at a much larger scale than the Industrial Revolution, a convergence of technologies that are not directly related to each other, but build on each other to have very significant and deep impact on social, economic, and political systems, right? So it's a convergence of clean energy, or what Jeremy Rifkin calls a clean energy internet. And what that means is an infrastructure that leverages renewables. And the key to understanding renewables that people often don't seem to appreciate is renewables just means free energy, right? Once the infrastructure is built out, you don't pay for it anymore. That's very different from a commodity like fossil fuels. Once it's built at scale, it'll provide massive energy for free for any kind of innovation you can imagine. Now, the country that leverages this first will dominate the world, for sure, just like the United States dominated electricity and fossil fuels. So this is the West, in my opinion, has just made a huge mistake not getting here faster. But at any rate, this includes renewables, smart grids, battery storage, a digitized mobility and logistics infrastructure, 5G, autonomous electric vehicles, AI, Internet of Things, and ultimately machines that augment human intelligence. And the key is to understand that we're entering a machine age, but it's not just a machine age for physical production like the Industrial Revolution, it's a machine age for the mind. And that kind of scope we don't fully understand or can predict. So this is my little forecast and where I think we're going. The post-pandemic world will mean large investments in upgrading energy grids, transforming buildings and transportation infrastructure, developing smart technology, optimizing energy efficiency. This is a given. This is what people call the Green New Deal. But that's inevitable, I think. It was probably going to happen anyway, but AI will make this different, right? It'll transform how we develop infrastructure, the kind of infrastructure we create. So this New Deal era will also include the use of AI and machine learning and augmenting decision-making, forecasting, data classification. And I think the most important quality about this is complex engineering. So I think that we'll see engineering at many, at a scale we haven't been able to just do before. We're talking maybe tens of millions, hundreds of millions of engineers working comprehensively on a single project across software platforms. So like the New Deal before, these investments will underwrite large-scale national works programs designed to mitigate a rising social and ecological crisis. And before I finish, I just want to go back to this one map of or chart of the United States to give you a sense of why I make this argument. So every time the United States has an economic crisis that could destabilize the whole country, it resolves it through investment and transformation, right? And that is one of the advantages of a democracy, that it can, this isn't a given, but that it can reorient itself fairly effectively when there's a critical mass of people that want it to happen. And you can see at every peak in US history, you've seen a massive transformation of the country. So there's good reason to believe that this final fourth peak, or this latest fourth peak, will be a similar transformation. I think the Green New Deal is the beginning of that, but I think too that even if the US is able to maintain itself as a global economic force or political force, it will be met by an equally powerful, if not more powerful, Asian force led by China. So the point being that the world is going to be different one way or the other, even if the US is able to effectively manage its current problems. So I think that's it. I have a final slide that just says thank you or something, but anyway, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. I'll give you a round of applause as the only person with sound, but I'd like to thank you for a wonderful presentation with a lot of pieces for us to digest. So thank you very much. I'm now going to take questions in the order that they were presented in the chat box. So the first person who I have is David Williams. David, if you want to ask your question, I can see it's been evolving, so you just have the first place.
All right, thank you. Fascinating presentation, Daniel. Thank you for that. But with artificial intelligence, we tend to look at, as you've said, the geopolitical, social, and commercial aspects of it. So I want to pick your brains about what do you think are the opportunities or the threats from organized crime using artificial or augmented intelligence?
Well, I could speak to that in a more broad way. It's not just organized crime; it's asymmetrical military technologies as well. So, for example, this recent war with Turkey, I don't know if you're familiar, where they use drones. When you combine renewables, drones, and missiles, essentially, you're going to reconstruct what militaries do. We don't need an industrial era conventional military anymore. And so what we're looking at is cyber espionage converging with drones, converging with what could be, to your point, a black market in disruptive technologies. So yeah, it's a massive problem. And it's another reason why we're going to need to become much more effective at governance than we have been so far. And I think COVID's a wake-up call, at least to Western countries, to get our shit together, because we're not doing this very well.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute.
Yep, thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, David. So the next question, I'm going to pass it over to Spencer Stober. Spence, are you with us?
Yes, I am. If you can see me.
Yes.
Daniel, that was a very insightful presentation. Thank you. Just a couple, originally I was going to ask a question about quantum computing, but I think it's a moot point after hearing your discussion, because I'm sure that with quantum computing, it's going to just exponentially hasten all of this. But if we take biological systems and bring that in, because I saw you had that information there about the role of genetics and DNA and so on, and all of the information in the biosphere is a sum total of genetic information that's stored in a different kind of a storage medium. And I'm wondering if and putting all nationalism aside, and we as a species, in our ability to be part of this emerging social system, has emergent properties just like biological systems, only what's driving it is the software and the information that we're able to augment our social systems with. Do you see something in the future where biological systems will play a bigger role in their relationship with these augmented artificial intelligence systems?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'll be honest, I shy away from biology for a few different reasons. It's not a particular interest of mine, but it is the case that we're increasingly able to design ourselves. I mean, to your point, that what we're going to do with the human being is equivalent to what we've already done with nature. And so what we become as a consequence of genomics and the manipulation of DNA is very hard to predict. So again, governance. I don't know how else to solve that.
Well, in biological systems, the emergence of all the complex systems driven by energy comes from randomness, and nature selects on random acts. Now, the question is, in our emergence of all of this data, the big data throughout the globe, as we move through this process, how much control do we have over that selection of that information, so that we have some control of the way our social systems emerge?
So you're saying, are you asking me whether this is complex and self-organizing, or whether this is?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, definitely. We don't understand that either, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we live in a complex system for sure. How much agency we have? I think we have more agency than people think. I think we're learning that now. Do we have enough agency to break evolution? No. So we're going to have to align ourselves. I mean, this is all about the human species maturing to a kind of adulthood where war is over, where we're governed by law, and where we are using science and research to do the right thing, to innovate and create a sustainable system for nature, for life on the planet, and for ourselves. We are reaching an end point in the history of using these technologies immaturely. So yeah, we have problems ahead.
Just one comment, and then I'll stop talking. But in the Washington Post, I think it was today or yesterday, there was an article that mentioned where Elon Musk must have made the statement that we should move to Signal as the app that's more secure in terms of protecting our data. And very shortly after that, there was a small company by the name of Signal Incorporated that was not even involved with the app, and their share price went from a few million to, like, I don't know if it was $1 billion or what. It was some big jump. So there's this potential for this information to just go haywire, and that's one of the challenges we have, I think.
Yeah, I see your point now. I see what you're getting at. You're saying information follow the same logics of complex systems, and as a consequence, what we're looking at is something. Yeah, this is another question about natural selection, as you point out, and about how evolution occurs in the human species, because there's an argument that information is driving us rather than the other way around, right? So
yeah.
Dan,
But you did a great job of predicting. I think it was, that's what we got to do.
Dan, there was one point which you kind of ran through quickly, which I would like to hear more of your thoughts on, is that and I have a blank on her name, but there was a Google data ethicist who just resigned, in part because
right,
kind of computational power that we need for AI, the kind of material infrastructure is such an ecological disaster that you have to weigh that as the kind of gains versus that. Now, you talked about a green infrastructure to underpin AI. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, I can't say exhaustively how this is going to go. I mean, there's no doubt that renewables have a long way to go, particularly battery storage. Right? We haven't reached maturity yet in that space in order to move off fossil fuels. But we know that logically we have to. And so it should drive an initiative beyond the United States, beyond Western countries as well, to come up with solutions that leverage clean energy and then do it at scale. Now, I don't think we have the answer for that yet, like in the sense that we still require combustion to develop rockets, to do a lot like concrete production. A lot of our basic resources hinge on some version of fossil fuels, including our roads, our infrastructure, our farming. There's a lot of work to do. So it's not just about, retrofitting cities, although that's critical, but it's also going to be about invention and innovation. And that's where we're going to need to augment our intelligence using data to come up with solutions. But as one concrete example, China wants to, I think it's by 2035, they want to put up a solar base station that will generate as much electricity as the Hoover Dam,
right,
and beam it down to Earth. So we could do that. It's not actually that complicated once you get the infrastructure in space. I mean, obviously it's vulnerable, but everything, we need peace accords of some kind to avoid this fear of vulnerability. But the point being that, there's room for innovation on the scale of what we saw, in the 19th to 20th centuries. We have to do again now.
Yeah. Look, I can't help but chuckle to myself, because don't worry, in America, we have the Space Force. Okay, next question goes to Mary. Mary, you want to jump in?
I did, thank you. We're very proud of you, Daniel. The College of Education of Illinois has produced a good scholar and a good thinker. So we'll take some credit for that. But you know, your presentation really begs a question that I'm not going to ask, but I'm going to just put it. What's the relationship between who and what region is dominant and the common good? Right. But, you know, that's a big question. I'm not going to ask you that. What I do want to ask you, though.
It's a pregnant question. I would love to answer it, but go ahead. Yeah.
You can answer it, but, you know, it involves value judgments plus empirical data. But you focus on innovation-driven order, right? And that's what I want to ask you about. We're in this innovation-driven order, and you described a China that is, you know, as a centralized system, control down, you know, focused, and America being kind of bottom up, you know, viral in terms of innovation. So I want to ask you, if innovation is the key, what kind of environment fosters the innovation that is required? And is it about application or is it about creativity? So China might be great at deploying and utilizing and harnessing, and America has traditionally been very good about breakthroughs and innovation because it's kind of on the ground and, you know, there's not the same control. So, you know, I'm asking you about the source of innovation and the environment that it needs.
Right. This is a question or a subject that's been debated back and forth for like the last 10 or 20 years, right? Does China have the liberal mindset necessary? Is it flexible enough psychologically, culturally, to create? And I think that the problem is that there's a legitimacy to the assumption that you need a liberal mindset to create, for sure. But the underlying issue with innovation is actually less about creativity and more about planning. So when the United States was very good at innovation, it could leverage its military, its investments through its military into long-term planning. And at least since the late 70s and 80s, that's collapsed, right? The idea of outsourcing innovation to the corporate sector was a mistake, right? Corporations are very good at distributing innovation, not very good at designing and developing it. Where China is strong is leveraging the state to align interests around long-term planning. So these 5-year plans. Now, it's not the communism of Russia where, and even there you had innovation. Bill would say that, right? But I think where you're going to see a lot of strength in China is to the last, sorry, I forget the last gentleman's point, self-organizing systems, right? China is a corporate entity, right? It's not a feudal tyranny, right? These are exaggerated perspectives on what China is. China is a Neo-Confucian corporate state, and it runs a 1.4 billion person corporation. And so in that context, it can leverage resources very efficiently. Can it be as creative as the United States? I would say no. The problem is the US has lost its anchor in inequality, right? The inequality is pushing it outside of its pattern of creativity that was able to leverage in the 20th century. It needs to bring back the state. This neoliberal drift was a huge, tragic mistake. And it needs to get over, I think, worshiping corporations as somehow, you know,
people.
Yeah, or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm now going to turn to Simone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you see me? Can you see me? Hear me? Okay. Oh gosh, I feel like a gin and tonic, but it's only 8 o'clock here in the morning in Melbourne, so it's probably a little bit too early. And I've got a couple of questions, but I'll start with the last one. So with all of this advancement and development and augmented intelligence, where do you see it leaving, you know, human mental health and well-being? Would that be something that's, you know, you rock up and talk to a computer about, or you know, if we're talking about optimizing human performance type of thing, will that be done by a computer? What do you think?
I think you could do that. I think that most people think of that as a dystopian future they don't want to go to. So I suspect that what we're looking at is a kind of dystopia where technology has been too empowered and there's too much focus on instrumentalization of tools and not enough on communities, right? And culture and creativity that is embedded in communities. We're going to need to balance technology with something else, right? That's not in this particular presentation, but I think what's happened, you know, if I had to frame it one way, I'd say religion, Christianity specifically in the West, was this community incubator, and that's collapsed. And so the cost of it is that it's turned everyone to the market, and the market has nothing to offer in that space. And so the ethical systems are in crisis. And so I'm not sure what solves that problem. It's a big one, but there's no doubt that it's going to be around community. And I think technology can be leveraged to that end, but it won't be the answer in itself. I got a fly harassing.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Dan, just to tack on to this, because I know you will have an answer to this, is that, you know, one of the fears that that is, you know, foreseen in the shift between to more automation is people losing their jobs, right? And if you look, what is the parallel of an identity politics of people losing their jobs in an industrial age in this country, in America? I'm Australian, but I live in America, right? Is it
I'm Canadian. I make that mistake all the time. Go ahead.
Is the toxic politics that we see in this country right now. So they have aligned statehood and industrial decline and the jobs that were somehow tied to the identity of the nation, right? How are we preparing for the blowback of, with more automation, with this kind of world that you are projecting? What happens to these people, and what identity do they cling on to? It's not the trade union, it's not the state, you know, is it these heroic politicians that supposedly come on the stage and claim to be the savior of the lost innovation?
Well, I'll be honest, right now it's race, right? Race and gender. So, I mean, that's the only thing left. I don't think the Marxist wish of the blue-collar labor uniting to overthrow the bourgeoisie is ever going to happen. What is happening is a transformation of capitalism through automation. Right? That is a kind of overthrow of sorts. I actually think, and we can talk about that, but I actually think we're heading for a post-capitalist era that's driven by data. Data is, I think, much more important than labor or capital. But to your point, what could replace, say, the laborer as a point of reference for a society? I think if you look at, you know, Michelle Bowen's work on peer-to-peer stuff, I think there's something to cooperatives and coordinating around community. I think that is inevitable. I think that it's a bit like Wikipedia. You know, if you don't have to work, you're still going to be productive. You're going to do something else. You know, you're going to edit an encyclopedia or something. And I think our society needs a lot more free labor that can work with people that need help, you know, whether it's the elderly or the sick. You know, there's a lot of people that are hurting, especially, you know, in this post-COVID era that's coming. There's a lot of work to do, but it might not be remunerated. That's the problem. And then the other side of it is that this feeds into basic income. Basic income is a great idea, but it's not sufficient, right? Like, it's just a national base. It's like a new version of the social welfare state. All good, but we're going to need something more comprehensive than that. I think there's room for a kind of a neo-Marxist movement that doesn't cling to the industrial age, like a post-industrial Marxism. I haven't seen it. I think most Marxists are backward-looking, but there's some room for that. Most people are very dismissive of just the terminology, so they're going to have a hard time aligning.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so Stephanie, you want to jump in and ask your question? Yeah. And again, anybody else has a question, just put your name in the chat box. Sorry, Stephanie.
Daniel, from Wellington, a Canadian in New Zealand. I just
all right.
That was amazing. I have a lot of questions and thoughts, but and you've touched on this through your whole presentation, but where do you see democracy in this new world order? We've seen so many, you know, we've seen the lights and the shadows of that through the whole of the pandemic, we start to see some of the gaps in partisanship and celebrity and politics and resistance movements. Where do you see the future of the Western democratic system as our dominant political structure?
Yeah, I think democracy is in crisis, quite frankly. I think that the tools that we've used to manage democracy are outworn. I think we need to develop platforms that can do what Facebook has done, or any kind of data-driven company to oversee large populations. Democracy is not scaling well. It never really has. We need to upgrade how we make decisions as a collective group. And that is the basis of democracy. It's not about one person, one vote. It's about having an intrinsic vested interest in steering your society. Part of the problem is that the capitalism we have today is overseen by a kind of, I would say, a totalitarianism that's built out of a class structure. And the cost is that people have lost faith in democracy, both internally and externally. China, in the United States or in the West, there's this argument that China is pushing this message that democracy, that the world doesn't need it and China's model is better. It's not actually the case, in my opinion. I think the world can see firsthand that democracy is in crisis. They don't need China to say anything. And so the consequence of that is that we need to upgrade. And if you look at the United States as sort of the standard bearer, I mean, I'm Canadian. I think Canadian democracy is doing quite a bit better, but that's not to say that it's immune. I think we need new tools. And I guess what I would say, more concretely is, people in democracies aren't interested in every issue, but they may be interested in what issue is closest to them. And they should have more agency in steering the policies than relying on technocracies to make that decision based on voting by itself. So I think we're going to need to rethink around democracy, which is to say, rethink how we steer our societies as a community, right? Again, we need more community. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Dan. Well, we have reached the end of our time.
Oh, so fun.
Well,
We got time for one more question.
yes, please jump in.
So I just wanted to ask also, just in relation to what you were saying, neo-Marxism and all that type of thing, have you read Klaus Schwab's book From the World Economic Forum? And is that what you're talking about, where we're moving to, where they're saying, we'll own nothing and we'll be happy about it? Is that the post-capitalism era type of thing?
Well, what I'm saying about post-capitalism is to say that, yeah, I'm aligned in that direction. What I'm saying is that what we're seeing is a breakdown in capitalism around property. So, for example, capitalism, the capitalism of Marx's criticism was anchored in the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. That's not the world we're entering now. The world we're entering now is driven by data. So it's exploiting the masses to then reprogram them, essentially, right? And that's feudalism, right? Which is, that sort of feeds back into Marx's argument that capitalism is neo-feudal. But what I think is occurring is a disjuncture in the capitalist system itself. Because if you don't need labor and you can automate production, but you do need data, then data is a different kind of capitalism. Now, how you resolve that is another question. I think what's going to happen is you'll see AI begin to innovate alongside human beings and alongside data. It'll digest that data and then generate, it's called generative AI, solutions to problems. And it'll become a highly automated system. Now, as we move far enough down the track, will we have enough to live on and all the rest, like universal basic services? In other words, transportation is free, some level of food production is free. Yeah, I think that's probably what's coming, actually. Highly automated society, yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
Answer my question. Why does it matter who's dominant? What's it got to do with the common good? Or which
it doesn't. It's just levels of, here, I'm leaning into this because it's a values question that you're asking. The problem with China leading is not that the Chinese are inherently unequal or corrupt or hive-minded or whatever it is the criticisms are. The problem is that in order to govern the world, you need a cosmopolitan system because there's so many different parts. And so it can't be China or the United States exclusively, right? The US is some circles out in the sense of being a little bit more cosmopolitan, but you can look at the treatment of African Americans to know that it's not that much further out than in China would be. So what the issue really is about developing systems in common that people share steering over that aren't anchored in empire, right? So it's a post-empire model. I don't know what that looks like, but I know that, and to circle back, China nonetheless is building empire because it's done it before. And so that's appears to be where we're headed here.
Thank you very much. And Simone, I've got to say, one of the best bits about your question was hearing a kookaburra in the background.
It's a magpie.
Oh, magpie. I have been outside of Australia that long that I don't even know my birds. There we go.
There you go. I've got 4 of them that we feed in the morning, and I'm living in like inner suburb Melbourne, so they're everywhere.
Anyway,
Awesome.
Dan, thank you again, and thank you everybody for wonderful questions and a great conversation. I want to let you know that this has been recorded, and along with Dan's slides, that will be on his presentation page on the events site. If you want to keep in touch with Dan, you can click on his profile and add him as a peer in CG Scholar, and that's a great way for to stay connected and keep the conversations going. And really what I want to end on is that, you know, Dan has a wonderful way of speaking the future as if we are going to live in this wonderful world. And it's going to take a lot of smart people and real hard work to create the kinds of things that he's talking about. And you know, I am feeling positive about our hope with the kinds of people that we have in this online space right now, and the kind of people, particularly in this organization studies research group, who are thinking about practically not just how we conceptualize the world, but what we need to be agents to impact and change the world. So, Dan, thank you for your hope, your prophecy, and your experience. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful time. Thank you. Gave me a lot to think about too. Listen to my own answers. I'm like, I think I need to think about it.
All right. So we'll see all of you in the asynchronous presentation rooms and the talking circles tomorrow. And we can bring a gin at any time. Please do, you know, it's the right time zone in the United States, so you're good to go. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Nice to meet you all. Thank you.